Picture a Stoic, and you probably picture someone who feels nothing when they lose someone. The actual philosophers looked nothing like that. Epictetus buried his own household, and Seneca spent whole letters walking grieving friends through their loss. Their discipline was never about refusing to grieve. It was about learning how to grieve without being wrecked by it. Most people who reject Stoicism reject a cartoon of it, the emotionless statue who shrugs off death. That cartoon isn't just wrong, it's backwards. Several of Stoicism's most famous texts exist specifically because someone the author loved died. The actual claim is narrower and more useful. You don't get to choose whether losing someone hurts, but you do get to choose what you do with that hurt. The dichotomy of control applied to grief splits the loss into two parts. The person is gone, which was never up to you, and how you live afterward, which is fully up to you. That split isn't cold comfort. It's the difference between a wound that stays open because you keep reopening it, and a wound that closes because you stopped fighting the one part you can't change. This isn't theory floated by someone who never lost anything. Epictetus started life enslaved, was maimed by a master, and only earned freedom in adulthood. His philosophy of control was assembled from what little control he'd actually been allowed to keep. So when he taught that some things are ours and some things aren't, he wasn't offering a productivity hack. He was describing the only way he'd survived. Which raises the real question this video is about. What exactly is yours to grieve, and what are you supposed to do with the rest? It's one thing to say, don't worry about your reputation. That's not up to you. It's another to say the same thing about your own child. Epictetus said exactly that, and he meant it as comfort, not as coldness. His argument, loving someone fully already requires accepting they were never yours to keep. They were on loan the entire time, the way health, a good season, or safe travel are on loan. He used a deliberately blunt training exercise, reminding himself, while kissing his own child goodnight, that he was kissing someone mortal, not to love them less, to love them without the illusion that loving them hard enough could keep them safe forever. Critics have called this exercise morbid for 2,000 years. But notice what it actually prevents. The specific kind of grief that comes from shock, the feeling that this loss broke some promise the universe made you. Epictetus is arguing the universe never made that promise. Grieving the loss is still real and still allowed. Grieving a broken promise that was never made is a second wound layered on top of the first, and that second wound is optional. That distinction, the loss itself versus the shock of feeling betrayed by reality, is where Stoic practice actually starts doing work. If Epictetus gives you the theory, Seneca shows you what it looks like to actually sit with someone who's grieving. He wrote several full letters of consolation, to a mother who'd lost a son, to a friend exiled and grieving his old life, to people processing loss in real time. None of these letters say stop crying. They walk through the loss point by point, and only then turn toward what's left to do with it. A typical Seneca consolation has a shape. First, he names the loss plainly, without minimizing it. Then he separates the grief that's proportionate to the loss from the grief that's grown past it, the part that's become identity instead of mourning. Then and only then, he points toward what the person in front of him still has: obligations, other relationships, work undone, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as evidence that a life continuing isn't a betrayal of the one that ended. In one letter, Seneca is comforting his own mother. He'd been sent into exile, and she was mourning him as if he were already dead. He tells her, in effect, grieve what's actually happened, not the worst thing your imagination has added on top of it. That's a strikingly modern insight, that a large share of suffering and loss comes from elaboration, not from the loss itself. Seneca's letters are, in a sense, the first known grief counseling scripts, structured, patient, and never once asking the mourner to feel nothing. Here's the distinction the whole cartoon version of Stoicism gets wrong. Equanimity was never the goal of feeling nothing. It was the goal of not being ruled by what you feel. A banked fire isn't an extinguished fire. The coals are still hot, still capable of lighting the next thing. Banking a fire is a skill, not a failure to keep it burning. Stoic grief works the same way. The loss stays real, stays felt, stays present. It's just no longer running the whole house. The alternative the Stoics were actually worried about wasn't too much feeling. It was grief that never stops directing every decision, years after the loss. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately as emperor, kept returning to short reminders of impermanence, not to feel less, but to keep perspective while running an empire through war and plague. Those reminders weren't detachment, they were maintenance. The fire needed tending, or it would either die out or burn the house down. That's the actual Stoic position. Don't let grief go out and don't let it run wild. Keep it banked, which is a completely different instruction than don't feel it, and a much harder one to follow. None of this is only useful if you lived in ancient Rome. 3 specific practices come directly out of this material, and all 3 still work. First, grieve the specific person, not a general fear of loss. Naming exactly what you miss keeps grief pointed at something real instead of spiraling into free-floating dread. Second, keep the gratitude and the grief in the same sentence. You don't have to choose between I'm devastated and I'm grateful I had them, because Seneca's letters treat both as true at once. Third, let grief move you towards something, not just hold you still. Seneca kept pointing mourners back toward obligations and relationships that were still alive, not to distract from the loss, but to prove a life could keep going without erasing what came before. None of these practices ask you to stop crying on a schedule. They ask you to keep doing the sorting work. This part is the loss. This part is what I still get to decide, for as long as it takes. That sorting is the entire discipline. It was never a trick for feeling less. Practice this way. Grief stops being something that only happens to you and becomes something you're actively doing. There's a real risk on the other side of all this. Some people use the word Stoic as a license to perform nothing, to treat not crying as the actual achievement. That's not equanimity. That's suppression wearing equanimity's name, and Seneca would have recognized it as a different, quieter kind of damage. Suppressed grief doesn't disappear. It tends to resurface as irritability, numbness in unrelated parts of life, or a version of the original loss that never got processed and never stops leaking out sideways. The actual Stoic writers describe crying, writing letters for years after a death, and openly naming how much something hurt. None of that reads as performance for an audience. The test isn't whether you cried. It's whether the loss is still quietly running your decisions long after you stop being honest about it. Real equanimity and performed coldness can look identical from the outside. The only place you can actually tell them apart is on the inside. So go back to the image this video opened with. A fire that's been put out has nothing left to give anyone. A fire that's been banked is still doing its job, just quietly, just lower. That's what the Stoics were actually describing when they wrote about loss, not the absence of grief, but grief that's been tended instead of left to burn out of control or go dark entirely. Epictetus lost his freedom and his family before he ever taught a single lesson about what's up to us. Seneca wrote his Consolations to real people, in the middle of real loss, without once telling them to stop feeling it. What they left behind isn't a method for feeling less. It's a method for staying warm without burning down the house. The grief that lasts is the grief you kept banked, not the one you try to put out.